Hello and welcome to another video. In this video, we'll talk about some really important programming concept. We're gonna start our conversation, our discussion about loops. What are loops? Why do we need them in programming? When to use them? That's what we're gonna be talking about in this video. So let's dive in. Let's start by defining what loops are. What are loops? A loop is a programming concept that you can use when you want to execute a piece of code, a piece of logic over and over again. So you have some instructions, some piece of code that you want to execute more than one time. This is what a loop is. Okay, that's the definition of a loop. Now, the more important question is, why do we need loops? Can we live our life without loops? And to answer that, let's go through an example. Let's say we want to solve a problem where a user enter 5 numbers. Let's say 5 integers. So the user input 5 integers and we want to compute the average of these 5 numbers that the user entered. Can we write a program using the knowledge that we already have? Remember that if you are watching the videos in order, what we know so far is how to do arithmetic operations, logical operations, comparison. We know how to print things on the screen, and we know how to use conditionals. We know what an if condition is. So this is the knowledge that we currently have. Can we solve the problem I just described using the knowledge that we currently have? Let's take a look. So to solve this problem using the knowledge that we already have, we essentially just start with a variable. We call this variable sum, and we initialize this variable with the value 0. So sum starts with the value 0. And then what we do is we get the first number that the user enter. So we output to the user enter an integer, and then the user enter a number, and then we save that number in the variable called num1. And then what we do afterwards is we add this num1 to sum. Sum plus equal num1, which is the same as saying sum is equal to sum plus num1. So now we got the first number from the user, and we added this number to sum. Now we need to repeat this logic for the second number. So we get num2 and we also add it to sum. And we repeat this again for num3, num4, and num5. So what do we have now? We have 5 variables, num1, num2, num3, num4, and num5. And these are the 5 numbers that the user entered. Now we want to output the average of these 5 numbers. So we just use a simple print statement and we say average is, and then sum divided by 5. And I want you to notice that this is a real division. It's a floating point division. Floating point division, which we talked about before when we talked about arithmetic operations. It's not an integer division. So it actually gives the real output of the division. So you divide sum divided by 5. That gives you the average of the 5 numbers that the user has entered. Let's run this program and make sure it's actually working. So let's say Python 3. And let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the average of this is 3, is that correct? So the addition, 15 divided by 5, that's 3. So the program is working correctly. So now back to my question. Were we able to solve this problem without using any loops, just by using the knowledge that we already know about Python? And the answer is yes, we actually were able to. But there are problems here. The problems are we are repeating the same logic over and over again. And this might be okay if we're repeating the logic only 5 times. It's definitely not okay in professional code, but I mean, it's feasible when it's just 5 numbers that the user enter. But what if the user has to enter 100 numbers, 1,000 numbers? Are we going to really repeat this 1,000 times? That doesn't make any sense. There has to be a better way of doing this. And this is where loops come into the picture. This is the problem that loops solve. Again, the definition of a loop is when you want to execute some piece of code or some logic over and over again. This is exactly what we are doing here. We have the same logic. What is the logic that we have? We want to get or to read a number that the user enter, and we want to add this number to a variable called sum. This is the logic that we want to repeat 5 times. And this is what loops are used for. In Python, there are 2 different types of loops. There's something called a for loop, and there's something called a while loop. Again, these are not just Python concepts. For loops and while loops exist in pretty much all programming languages. In this video, we will be focusing on for loops, and then in a later video, we'll talk about while loops. So what I want to do in this video is I want to be able to solve a problem like this using a for loop. And we're going to see how much simpler our code will be. So what do we need to do if we want to solve this same exact problem using for loops? Let's see. Here is how to do it. So if you want to rewrite the program using for loops, this is what the program will look like. Well, I still have to explain what this does, but just look at it. It's much simpler than what we had before. Much simpler. Now let's actually go through this code and explain what every line does. So in the beginning, we still have a variable called sum, and we initialize this variable with the value 0. Similar to what we had before. There's no difference here. Here is where the difference happens. This is what a for loop looks like. This is the syntax of a for loop. You can immediately see that it's very similar to the if conditions, where you have a statement. So in this case, it's a for statement, and then you have a colon, and then you have an indentation, and then you have your body. We're going to go through these again, but it's very similar to if conditions, to the structure, to the syntax of if conditions. So if you haven't watched the videos about conditionals and if conditions, I highly encourage you to watch these videos first, because this is when I explain all of these indentations and the colons and all of these things in detail. But if you understand them, this will be a piece of cake. Now let's go through this for loop again and discuss it in more detail. So the first thing is you can see that we have here the for keyword. This is how you represent a for statement. So right next to the for statement or the for keyword, you have something called I. I is basically just a variable name. So any variable name can work here. It doesn't need to be I. It can be I, J, K, or any name that is a legitimate, proper variable name. This I, I'm going to write this here, is actually referred to as the loop counter. As the loop counter. This is important. And then we have another keyword, which is called in. And this is part of the for statement. This is part of the for statement. So we have 2 keywords here. We have the for keyword and the in keyword. We need both of these to define a for statement. And then afterwards here, we have another thing called range 5. Range 5. What is range and what is 5? I can't properly explain what range is right now because, again, first of all, I'm assuming you're an absolute beginner and I haven't talked about what functions are yet. Range is actually a function. It's a built-in function in Python, so it comes with Python. Built-in function. And we're going to talk later about what functions are. We're going to talk in details about what functions are, but we haven't talked about them yet. So what I want you to understand for this video is when you say range 5, like in this case, what's going to happen is you're telling Python, I want this body, which is actually called the loop body. So this part over here, this is the loop body. You want Python to execute this loop body 5 times. Very similar to what we had before with our previous code. We want to execute this body 5 times. If it was range of 10, then we would have executed it 10 times. But for this program, we want to execute it only 5 times. That's why we have range of 5, okay? and then we have the colon here. And then after the colon, this is when you take the indentation and then you write down what your loop body is going to be. And the loop body is the set of instructions. It's a group of instructions that are going to be executed 5 times. Another concept that I want to explain in this context is what we call a loop iteration. A loop iteration. What is a loop iteration? So we said that this body is going to be executed 5 times. Each one of them, each time this body is being executed is called an iteration. So you can think of it as we're having iteration 0, iteration 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is what a loop iteration means. Okay, so it's very important that you understand these concepts very, very, very well. So you know what the syntax of a for loop is. Use the for keyword, use the in keyword. You have a loop counter. In this case, we call the loop counter I, but it doesn't need to be I. It can be any variable name, and we're going to see how we can use it. And we have the range function. Range is not necessary in a for loop, but for now, for the sake of this specific example, we're using the range, and I want to explain what the range is. A range is a built-in function that will execute whatever is in the body 5 times. As many times as the number you put inside the parentheses inside the range. You also understand what a loop body is. It's the block of code that is going to be executed multiple times. And we understand what a loop iteration is. A loop iteration is each iteration the body is getting executed. Now let's look at this code. What are we actually doing here in the loop body? We are basically reading the input from the user, and we're storing this in another variable called num. And then we're adding this num to sum. And we're doing this 5 times. Very interesting. This is going to exactly result in the same output that we had before. We're going through the loop, we're reading the input from the user, we're storing this input in a variable called num, and then we're adding num to sum. How many times are we doing this? We're doing this 5 times. And then at the end, in line number 6, we're just printing out the average is, and then sum divided by 5. Let's run this code and see what we're gonna get. So if we do Python 3, and then it's called for fixed. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The result is 3.0. It's the same exact result that we got before. Okay, cool, but this is not enough. I haven't really talked about what the loop counter is. The loop counter, which is I here, like what is it really doing? Everything else we understand what it's doing. We understand range 5. We understand that this will execute the body 5 times. And we understand the logic that we have inside the body of the for loop. But what is I here? Well, I, in this specific example, is not really doing anything. But what the loop counter actually does, so the loop counter, in this case, the variable name of the loop counter is I, is that in each iteration, this loop counter will have an integer value that represents the iteration number starting from 0. So for example, we said that here the loop body will be executed 5 times, which means we have 5 iterations. We have 5 iterations. In each iteration, this loop counter, which is I, will be assigned a value that is equal to the number of the iteration. And the numbers of the iterations start from 0. Again, this is not always going to be the case. We're going to talk about some advanced ways to write a for loop where I can start with any arbitrary value. But if you have your for loop written like this, for I in or for any variable in range, and then you put an integer inside this range, then the loop variable will start with 0. So the iteration number, the first iteration, I will have the value of 0. The second iteration, I will have the value of 1. And then the third iteration, I will have the value of 2, and then 3, and then 4. So these are the 5 iterations that we are talking about. So based on the iteration number, I will be assigned a different value. How can we make sure that this is the case? Think about it. Well, we can just output the value of I inside the body and see what the value of I is. So let's check this out. Let's comment this out for now. And let's comment this out as well. And here, what I want to do is I just want to print the value of I. Just because I want to check what the value of the loop counter is inside the for loop. Now let's run this program again. And you can see, first of all, the loop body was executed 5 times and the value of I changed based on your iteration. So in the first iteration it was 0 and then 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, I have to be very clear here. This is not always going to be the case, but if you have your for loop statement written like this, for I in range and then some value here, this is what you're going to get. Your loop counter will start with 0 and then it will be incremented by 1 every time you go to the following iteration. I want to keep things simple for now, but soon enough we're going to be talking about more advanced ways of writing for loops where this rule is going to change. But the main point that I want to explain is for you to understand what a loop counter is, because it's going to be very useful when you solve specific types of problems. Now let's take another example, because there are many things we can do with for loops. Let's say instead of the user having to input only 5 numbers, let's say that the user can input an arbitrary number of numbers, so an arbitrary number of integers. And the way the program will work is we're going to start the program by asking the user, how many numbers are you going to enter? And then the user input an integer number, which is going to be the number of integers that the user is going to enter. And then after that, we're going to ask the user one number at a time. So essentially, we want to have the same program, but instead of only doing 5 iterations, we're going to do a dynamic number of iterations based on a variable that the user input. So let's see how we can use for loops to do this. So here's how the code looks like. We again start with sum is equal to 0. And then here's the difference. We define another variable called iteration count. And we get this iteration count from the user. We ask the user how many numbers you would like to input. We read this value from the user as an integer, and then we store it in the iteration count variable. Perfect. Now, what we want to do is we want to have a loop. You want to have a for loop. The number of iterations that we want to have is the number stored in the iteration count variable. So basically to do this, we just have a for statement. And then in the range, we put this iteration count, which is a variable that is input by the user. And that means that whatever is in the loop body is going to be executed an iteration count number of times. An iteration count number of times. So if the user input 5, this will be executed 5 times. If the user input 100, then this code right here will be executed 100 times. Again, simple code. It's the same exact code that works for any value that the user input. And that is the real value of loops. And finally, in line number 8, all we need to do is just print out the average, which is going to be the sum divided by the iteration count. Now let's run this code and see what we get. Python 3, and it's called for. Okay, how many numbers you like to input? Let's say maybe 3 numbers. Let's say 1, 3, and 5. And we get that the average is 3. Is that correct? 9 divided by 3 is 3, so that is the correct answer. But you can see that I could have said, let's say 7. And then let's input these numbers, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you get the new average. So it looks like the code is working correctly. Very simple code. That's the value of looping. Remember that we also have this loop counter here that we're not really doing anything with, because we don't really use the value of I, the value of the loop counter here. When you have something like this, where your loop body is not actually using the loop counter, it's just idiomatic. It's a good practice to have your variable name as just an underscore, which is a valid, legitimate variable name. And this kind of signals that, the loop counter that we're using here is not really going to be used in the loop body. But if we want to use the value of I in this loop body, what we can do is maybe here we can say enter, let's have this as an F, oops. Let's have this here, put F, and then you can say enter the integer number, and then here we put the value of I. And since we know that I is going to start from 0, maybe we want to output the user starting from 1. So we can say enter the integer number 1, and then 2, and then so on. In this case, we just add 1 to the variable I, to the loop counter I, and then let's see what we're gonna get here. So if we run this program again, let's say we want to enter 4 numbers. So enter the integer number 1, let's say it's 0. Enter the integer number 2 is 1, integer number 3 is 6, and integer number 4, let's say it's 8. Now you get that the average is 3.75. So this is just an example of how to use the loop counter inside the body of your loop. So to summarize, in this video, we learned about loops as a concept. Why do we need loops in programming? What are the situations where we actually use them? We specifically talked about for loops. We said there are 2 different types of loops. There are for loops, there are while loops. These types of loops are not just in Python, in other programming languages as well, but in this video, we only focused on for loops. There are more to for loops than what I have talked about in this video, but we will talk about this later. But for now, I want you to make sure that you master how to write a simple for loop with a range function, how to execute a piece of logic more than one time. Just get comfortable with that, master that, and then after you do this, you can move on to the next step. All right? So that's the video for today, and I'll see you in the next video.